Thank you, Dean Kauhi, for those words of introduction and your warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here at the Center for Global Transformation at the University of California at San Diego, and to watch the beautiful ocean in front of me and to see all such friendly faces in the audience. I just got here from Bangalore in India. That's in the south of India, for those of you who haven't been to my country. It's considered the technology capital, the Silicon Valley of India in some ways. And it's a hub of global technology. A lot of R&D goes on there. But it's also a city that when I was growing up used to be called a pensioner's paradise. I'm a pensioner there, but it's no longer paradise, I can assure you, because it's grown every which way. And like most of our cities, it's coping with a lot of influx of population and development of infrastructure, long way to go in that direction. But it's very much a symbol and a living embodiment of a very vibrant democracy, defined by diversity, and so expressive of what India is today. The topic of my speech today is India in the Indo-Pacific world. And I'm going to look at it from my experience as a diplomat for my country. I served almost 4 decades as a diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service, so most of my life has essentially been in the trenches, dealing with difficult relationships as with our neighbors. I was India's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. There, I think, the first Indian woman to be High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. I was also the first and only Indian woman so far to be the spokesperson of the Indian Foreign Office, which I can assure you is one of the toughest jobs that you can imagine. Spokespersons anywhere will tell you that. So I chose this topic because I believe it expresses so much of what challenges India faces in its diplomacy concerning the immediate neighborhood as well as the region beyond. And it was interesting also because this definition of India and the Pacific coming together in the Indo-Pacific, and in fact something that the Americans have embraced quite enthusiastically over the last few years. You're aware that the United States Pacific Command has now been called the Indo-Pacific Command. It's based out of Hawaii, as you know, and some put it expressively as a region stretching from Hollywood to Bollywood. So that's the Indo-Pacific world. So let me begin by saying how in June 2018, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India spoke of India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, the subject of our discussion today. It had been a good year so far in what has come to be termed as India's Act East policy. We began with Look East, as you know, sometime in the early 90s, and now it's sort of metamorphosized into Act East, which I would understand it as something much more activist, much more action-oriented, much more focused in terms of the drive and determination that India attaches to relations with Southeast Asia and East Asia and the world beyond. So that year, 2018, 10 leaders of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, had together visited Delhi as the government of India's honored guests on Republic Day, which falls on 26 January every year. So January 2018, they had all come to Delhi. And it was befitting that they should have come from the East, as the Prime Minister termed it. He's fond of really connecting these images. And he said the East was to which the Indians had always turned for thousands of years. It was to the rising East that humankind, as he said, was now turning to see the promise that the 21st century held for them. The destiny of the world, he said, would be deeply influenced by the course of developments in the Indo-Pacific region, and that this was a new age of promise. He was confident that the future that awaited us all would not be as elusive as Shangri-La. Those of you who've read James Hilton's book would know that. And that the collective hopes and aspirations of the peoples of the region would shape that future. Singapore had shown the way in this regard with its openness and dynamic spirit. For that great nation, in Mr. Modi's words, had shown us that when the oceans are open, the seas are secure, countries are connected, the rule of law prevails, and the region is stable, nations, small and large, prosper as sovereign countries, free and fearless in their choices. For India, the term Indo-Pacific is a concept that embraces both the terrestrial world and the oceanic. And as you know, in very many ways, India sees itself as a terrestrial power as well as an oceanic country. And just as the Himalaya mountain ranges have become a source of divine strength and inspiration for Indians through the ages, the idea of India has equally been defined by the oceans that surround us. And let me use a Sanskrit phrase, which I'll explain. Setu Himachalam. It's the motto of the Survey of India, the organization that mapped the vast expanse of our subcontinent from the British days. The peninsular expanse and the heartland of the Indo-Gangetic plain and the mountains that we believe are abodes of the gods. This is Setu Himachalam, that is from the sea that surrounds the peninsula down in the south to the soaring stratospheric Himalaya. You say in this country from sea to shining sea, and we say from the sea to the mountains. And most importantly, these seas are human seas. Both the Bay of Bengal on the eastern shores of our peninsula, our gateway to Southeast Asia, and the Arabian Sea that links us to the Arab world are both human seas, seas that were navigated, crisscrossed by human encounter, the gates of our history, of trade, communication, each wave of contact, refreshing and rejuvenating our collective histories as a people and defining the diversity and pluralism of our societies in a perfect encapsulation of give and take. It is no wonder, therefore, that the Prime Minister's words express the feelings of more than 1 billion Indians. Our interests in the region are vast, and our engagement is deep, he said. His words thus spoke of an India engaged in multifaceted ways with the region, relationships that spanned east to west, those famous twins of history, from the Pacific Island nations to Russia, Japan, Korea, and China, thence to the ASEAN 10. And for India, the definition of the Indo-Pacific, particularly the world of the Indian Ocean, that formative influencer of our history, has to include the nations of East Africa and the Arab nations and Iran, important in their impact on what we are as the people of India. Beyond the poetic vision of his words, Mr. Modi was also conscious of the insecurities in the region, of our living on the edge of uncertainty and internal dislocations, new fault lines in trade and competition, the assertion of power over recourse to international norms, the challenges of terrorism and extremism, a world of interdependent fortunes and failures, as he termed it. No nation could shape or secure such situations on its own. Regional dialogue, cooperation, diplomacy, and structures that enhanced mutual security and economic well-being were necessary. What was India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, the Prime Minister asked, and he went on to elaborate it. Firstly, he said, it stood for a free, open, inclusive region including all nations in this geography, as also others beyond who have a stake in it. Secondly, the core of the region, he said, was the ASEAN, the golden lands, as we say in Sanskrit, Suvarna Bhumi, of Southeast Asia, the world where the Ganges, the sacred river of India, and the Mekong, the fountainhead of Southeast Asia, were conjoined. Thirdly, he said that the goals of common prosperity and security required us to evolve through dialogue a common rule-based order for the region, an order that believed in sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the equality of all nations, irrespective of their size and their strength. Multilateralism and regionalism were mutually reinforcing concepts of this worldview of the Indo-Pacific based on a principled commitment to the rule of law. Fourthly, all nations should have equal access as a right under international law to the use of common spaces on sea and in the air that required freedom of navigation. Some of you must remember the Mare Liberum of Hugo Grotius, unimpeded commerce and the peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law. There was need to come together to prevent maritime crimes, preserve marine ecology, protect against disasters, and prosper from the blue economy of the ocean. Fifthly, there was need to resist protectionism and to secure a level playing field for all, an open and stable international trade regime that lifted all nations in the tide of trade and investment. Sixthly, connectivity was vital to unite the region, not only physical connectivity, but based on mutual trust. Such initiatives should be based on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, consultation, good governance, transparency, viability, and sustainability. Trade, not strategic competition, should be the benchmark. Finally, contests should not become conflict. Differences should not become disputes. It was the responsibility of both existing and rising powers to ensure that their choices built a united world and did not force new divisions. Now, all this is a lofty vision, one that we would find hard to disagree with. And India has obviously attached, the government has attached a great deal of seriousness to the work it intends to do oriented to the Indo-Pacific world. In April this year, the Ministry of External Affairs, which is our equivalent of the State Department in the government of India, set up a new desk or a division, as the Delhi nomenclature goes, called the Indo-Pacific Division. Well-wishers put forth some ideas about what the new unit should focus on, that it should look west to Africa too, since the vision of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific should incorporate both West and East, and that it would be good to host an India-Africa summit with the United States invited as a participant. Another idea was to lead a discussion of quality infrastructure within the Indian Ocean Rim Association, an intergovernmental organization consisting of 22 coastal states bordering the Indian Ocean, headquartered in Mauritius, of which the United States, Japan, and China are dialogue partners. India could take a lead in re-engaging Japan and the African Union to take forward the initiative to advance an Asia-Africa growth corridor, was another idea put forward. In the security sphere, the Milan naval exercises held by India's Andaman and Nicobar Command, located in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the far south of the Bay of Bengal, bordering Malaysia and Indonesia, could be expanded to include Japan, France, and the United States, all Indo-Pacific nations. Integrating the Pacific world with that of the Indian Ocean, a joint summit of members of the Indian Ocean Rim Association and the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation could be held. Now, all this would suggest that a new dawn is upon us in the Indo-Pacific. But the real world is not a perfect place, as experience would tell us. Some observers take the view that the term Indo-Pacific has altered the mind map. Its predecessor, the Asia-Pacific, linked the United States and East Asia. The Indo-Pacific, as used by the Trump administration, suggests that India, the United States, and the major Asian democracies, Japan and Australia included, will be at the front, resisting China in a new framework of growing Cold War-style politics. Chinese scholars particularly say that geopolitics is a major driver in all this, brought on by the US reaction to China's precipitate rise and re-emergence. This is a new balance of power framework in evolution. Therefore, an Indo-Pacific strategy for the region is in essence led by the United States, these views have it, in order to contain the rise of China and safeguard American leadership in the region. Japan, as a key ally of the United States in the region, plays an important role in this visualization and promotion of the idea, being equally concerned about China's rising economic and military capabilities. India, the view goes, as a country with great national ambition, can utilize the opportunity with American support and encouragement to promote its interests in Southeast Asia, its outreach to East Asia, and strengthen military, political, and economic cooperation with the US and its allies, thus increasing its overall influence in international affairs. Australia, on the other hand, is a willing participant in this strategy since it wants to increase its presence and scope and interests in Southeast Asia. And as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, the key link area between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, there are variations in response. The big ASEAN members like Indonesia and Singapore are not averse to working the concept to enhance their strategic influence and presence, while the smaller members are unsure about their moves since they are caught between China and the United States. The overarching question raised in all this is whether the United States has the long-term vision and the resources to build on its Indo-Pacific strategy and lead in its translation to realities on the ground, or literally in the two oceans involved. In Bangkok this week at the 2019 Indo-Pacific Business Forum and the East Asia Summit in Bangkok, the United States Department of State released a progress report on the implementation of the US whole-of-government approach for the Indo-Pacific region. The report, entitled A Free and Open Indo-Pacific, Advancing a Shared Vision, spoke of the Trump administration's abiding commitment and deep engagement with the region in areas such as infrastructure, energy, the digital economy, strengthening civil society and democratic institutions, countering transnational threats, and investing in human capital across the 35 countries and economies of the Indo-Pacific. Secretary of State Pompeo, in his prefatory remarks, listed India as a strategic partner of the United States with whom his country was addressing shared challenges and advancing a shared vision. President Trump's words from November 2017 were recalled, that the Indo-Pacific was a beautiful constellation of nations. Emphasis on beautiful. The United States, quote, is and always will be an Indo-Pacific nation, unquote, the report proclaimed. To quote, from our first trading ships that departed for Canton just after the American Revolution to our first consular presence in Kolkata in 1794, US engagement in the Indo-Pacific is a story of trade, exchange, shared sacrifice, and mutual benefit, unquote. But there were challenges, as the document went on to state, the most consequential being that posed to US and partner interests in the growing competition between free and repressive visions of the future international order and authoritarian revisionist powers seeking to advance their parochial interests at others' expense. The United States would compete vigorously against attempts to limit the autonomy and freedom of choice of Indo-Pacific nations. It would champion the values of respect for sovereignty and independence of all nations, peaceful resolution of disputes, free, fair, and reciprocal trade based on open investment, transparent agreements, and connectivity, adherence to international law, including freedom of navigation and overflight. This vision, it elaborated, aligned closely with Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific concept, India's Act East policy, Australia's Indo-Pacific concept, the Republic of Korea's new Southern policy, and Taiwan's new southbound policy. Where the latter was concerned, the United States was opposed to Beijing's, I quote, actions to bully Taiwan through military maneuvers, economic pressure, constraints in its international space, and poaching of its diplomatic partners, unquote. The growing partnership with India was highlighted, saying that a strong India-US partnership is vital to the US Indo-Pacific vision. India had become a major defense partner, having purchased more than $16 billion US dollars of American defense platforms, with billions more in the pipeline. A bilateral communications compatibility and security agreement to facilitate defense cooperation had been concluded. The United States and India were working together to address regional and global development challenges. One institutional framework was specifically mentioned, the US, Australia, India, Japan quadrilateral consultations, the Quad as it's called, and it's a specific Chinese bugbear, as you know, that had been elevated to ministerial level from September 2019 in a historic first, and which was working on maritime security, quality infrastructure, regional connectivity, and counterterrorism and cybersecurity. The references to China were stark and uncompromising. The report stated, the People's Republic of China practices repression at home and abroad. Beijing is intolerant of dissent, aggressively controls media and civil society, and brutally suppresses ethnic and religious minorities. Such practices, which Beijing exports to other countries through its political and economic influence, undermine the conditions that have promoted stability and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific for decades, unquote. PRC claims in the South China Sea, it said, were unfounded, exemplified as they were by the preposterous 9-dash line. I think most of us would agree. I mean, who understands the 9-dash line? And were unlawful and unreasonable, imposing real costs on other countries who were inhibited from accessing over $2.5 trillion in recoverable energy reserves as a result. Instability and the risk of conflict were real as a result of this Chinese position. 67 years ago in New Delhi, in a meeting with Indian journalists and cultural personalities, embarking on a visit to the newly minted People's Republic of China, Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, said that the challenge between India and China was one that ran across the spine of Asia. Those were his exact words. In the Indo-Pacific, India and China are the two major terrestrial and maritime powers, with their roots firmly originating in the region. Collectively, they've molded the idea of Asia through their contacts over history with the countries of the region. Indo-China, as the synonym for Southeast Asia, embodies the essence of that cross-fertilization of ideas involving India and China, their capital, their trade, and human migration. As two large neighbors that share an extended and unsettled mountain frontier, the largest unresolved boundary dispute in the world today, India and China coexist, they compete, they are strategic rivals, not partners, and their relations are in a state of flux. Memories of a bitter and humiliating border conflict cloud the Indian perspective of China, as also the onerous weight of a huge trade imbalance with China that India runs of over 50 billion US dollars. China's accelerating military strength and capability, coupled with a huge lead in economic power and influence, ensure a state of perpetual strategic wokeness about China in India. But to what extent does India want battle lines drawn? Mind games give way to the realism of dealing with a next door neighbor who isn't going away and is someone you have to craft a modus vivendi with. There is complex diplomatic and strategic footwork involved here, and it tests our capabilities constantly. We have kept the peace on our borders with China for over 4 decades now, and that is no mean achievement. Our relationship is not inoculated against sudden tension, as the Doklam episode inside Bhutan in 2017 demonstrated. But we have the capability of drawing back from brinkmanship on both sides. But China's raised profile of activity in our neighborhood keeps us up nights, especially its support of Pakistan, its so-called iron brother. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is an example of this, as also the recent Chinese pronouncements on Kashmir, which demonstrate a clear bias in favor of Pakistan. The dabbling in Sri Lankan waters, literally, is another example. The situation challenges India, exposing China's lead and India's shortcomings in resource availability, military strength and modernization, diplomatic agility, project choices and implementation, and the creation of a South Asian Commons, which ideally should have India at the hub strategically, economically, and in terms of connectivity. Now, the question may be asked, is India bold enough to deal with this? Now, caution and circumspection define India's moves, especially in dealing with our largest neighbor, which is China. This is also seen in the manner in which we project our association with the Quad of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, and in our reluctance to even take the name of the group directly in our references to its meetings and discussions, for obvious reluctance not to provoke China on this score at least. The jury is out on whether India will ever endorse an elevation of Quad status to the level of a strategic grouping. This week's news for the region has also been led by India's announcement by none other than Prime Minister Modi himself, and quite in contradiction, may I add, to what you heard him say at the Shangri-La Dialogue, that India would not sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement or the RCEP after participating in discussions on the agreement since their inception in 2012. The move was obviously dictated by strong opposition from farm, dairy, and trading lobbies, the last worried about the China factor and the flooding of Chinese goods into the Indian market, from within India. So domestic policy obviously trumped larger considerations of regional economic integration and the vision of an Act East policy and an Indo-Pacific concept being buttressed if India had entered such a pact. The implications are unfolding, but they will challenge India's credentials to prove that it is fully committed to being that bridge builder for the Indo-Pacific and acting east with purpose and commitment, joining regional supply chains and being increasingly integrated with the region in terms of trade, technology, and structural economic reforms and adjustments. India's External Affairs Minister recently said that India's neighborhood remains its first circle of priority. At the same time, with regard to the geopolitics of the larger region of the Indo-Pacific, Delhi follows a policy of multi-alignment with major powers and the focus is on being a balancing and stabilizing force. India's geography gives it immense advantage in the region, particularly its position as a pivot of the Indian Ocean and its omnidirectional linkages across the latter's expanse. The rivalry between China and the United States imposes its constraints in the region, and India is no exception. For India, therefore, to focus on its neighborhood relationships and with its partners in ASEAN and with like-minded democracies, particularly Japan, and with the Gulf countries, home to the largest Indian diaspora in the world, and with the east coast of Africa, the island states of Indian Ocean and the Pacific, makes eminent sense. The priority is India's rapid ascent on the scale of economic development, technology improvement, infrastructure, and connectivity, and leveraging the full potential of the gifts it is naturally endowed with as a result of its oceanic geography. This will require engagements on various fronts: strategic, economic, political, and security. Over-securitization of the region is not an Indian goal. I believe that the priority is maritime domain awareness, connectivity, economic engagement, creating a rule-based, globally credible and coherent order for the region that respects sovereignty and territorial integrity, is against unilateralism and unwillingness to adhere by international legal institutions, and that which promotes human and energy security. The Indo-Pacific, therefore, in my view, ladies and gentlemen, is an evolving definition and concept, and its contours are far from being set. Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions.